Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore the extraordinary within the ordinary, sharing heartfelt tales of love, redemption, and resilience. Today's story follows Jack Monroe, a man whose soulful voice carried his pain and dreams to the streets, until an act of kindness and a surprising discovery changed his life forever. Jack Monroe stood on the corner of 5th and Main, strumming his old guitar, its wood worn smooth by years of use. His fingers moved effortlessly over the strings, coaxing melodies from the instrument that seemed to echo his own heartache. Jack's voice, deep and soulful, carried through the cold air, weaving stories of love, loss, and shattered dreams. People passed by in waves, their faces blurred by indifference. A few tossed spare coins into the open guitar case at his feet, but most didn't even glance his way. Jack had long stopped expecting anything else. At 40, Jack's life had not turned out as he had once hoped. There had been a time, years ago, when the world seemed full of possibility. Music was his everything, a way to connect with others, a way to express the emotions he couldn't always put into words. It was a gift passed down from his father, Michael Monroe, a man whose rich baritone once filled their modest home with warmth. Michael had been Jack's hero, his guide, and his greatest supporter. One day, Jack, his father used to say, "The world will hear your voice. You've got something special." Those words, spoken in the glow of lamplight as Michael taught Jack to play guitar, had stayed with him long after his father's untimely death. Michael had died suddenly when Jack was only 12. Leaving a void that nothing could fill. The man who had seemed larger than life was gone, and Jack's world was thrown into chaos. His mother, Susan, had tried to hold things together, but grief consumed her. One day, she left without a word, vanishing like a wisp of smoke. Jack never saw her again. At first, he clung to the hope that she would return, that she had simply needed time to heal. But days turned into months, and months into years, and the harsh truth became inescapable. She was gone, and Jack was alone. He had spent most of his life since then drifting. Shelters, street corners, and temporary jobs defined his existence. Yet, through it all, music remained his one constant. On the streets, Jack played for anyone who would listen, pouring his soul into songs that carried the weight of his struggles. His music wasn't polished, but it was real, a raw expression of everything he had endured. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his father's dream for him was slipping further out of reach with each passing day. It was on one such day, as Jack stood in his usual spot, singing a mournful tune about loss and regret, that a chance encounter would change everything. The sky was gray, the city bustling with people hurrying about their lives. Jack's fingers ached from the cold, but he kept playing, his voice steady despite the chill. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed an elderly woman standing nearby, her brow furrowed in distress as she fumbled through her purse. Jack paused mid-song, his natural instinct for kindness overriding his own struggles. Approaching her cautiously, he asked, "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman looked up, startled but grateful. "I've lost my wallet," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how I'll get home. I live far from here, and I don't have any money for a cab." Jack glanced at his guitar case. The few bills and coins inside weren't much, but they represented his food for the day. He hesitated only for a moment before reaching down and scooping up his earnings. "Let me help you," he said softly. He hailed a taxi, helped the woman into the back seat, and handed the driver his hard-earned money. "Take her wherever she needs to go," Jack instructed. The driver nodded, and the woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't even know your name." "Jack," he replied, offering a gentle smile. "And it's no problem. Everyone needs help sometimes." Jack watched as the taxi pulled away, leaving him alone on the cold sidewalk. His guitar felt heavier as he slung it over his shoulder and returned to his corner. The afternoon wore on, and though the city remained as indifferent as ever, Jack played his heart out, finding solace in the music even as his stomach growled with hunger. He didn't expect anything to come from that moment of kindness. For Jack, it was just another day in a life where hope felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet, as he strummed his worn guitar and sang his songs of forgotten dreams, the world was quietly preparing to surprise him. A few days later, as Jack sang his usual set of melancholic songs, the winter air biting at his fingers, he noticed a familiar figure weaving through the crowd. It was the elderly woman he had helped, now moving with purpose toward his corner. Jack stopped mid-strum. His curiosity piqued as she approached, her breath visible in the cold air. "Jack," she called out, her voice warm and determined. Jack straightened, surprised. "Ma'am," he said, setting his guitar down gently. "You found your way back. Are you all right?" "I wanted to thank you," she said, her expression sincere. "What you did for me, most people wouldn't have bothered. You gave me the little you had, even though you clearly needed it yourself." Jack shrugged, feeling slightly awkward under her gaze. "It was nothing," he said. "Anyone would have done the same." The woman smiled knowingly. "No, Jack, not everyone would have. That kind of kindness, it's rare." Before he could protest further, she reached in her handbag and pulled out a small envelope. She pressed it into his hands. "This is for you," she said. "It's not much, but I wanted to give you something to show my gratitude." Jack hesitated, his pride battling with his need. "You don't owe me anything," he murmured, holding the envelope uncertainly. "I insist," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes softened as she studied him. "There's something about you, Jack," she said thoughtfully. "Your voice, it sounds so familiar." Jack blinked, confused. "Familiar? What do you mean?" The woman hesitated, as if grappling with a memory. "Your voice reminds me of someone I used to know," she said slowly, her eyes misty. "His name was Michael Monroe. We used to sing together when we were young." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Michael Monroe was my father," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he's been gone for a long time." The woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Your father was Michael?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "I can't believe it. He was a wonderful man, and he always talked about his son. He said you had the voice of an angel." A lump formed in Jack's throat. His father's voice, warm and full of dreams, echoed in his mind. "He was a good man," Jack said softly, his throat tightening with emotion. "But he's gone, and so is everything he believed in." The woman, who introduced herself as Mary, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Your father was right," she said firmly. "You do have a gift. Jack, I can hear it. It's raw, but it's real. You're not just some street performer. You're a storyteller. People need to hear you." Jack shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "I'm a homeless man," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. "Nobody cares about what I have to say, let alone my voice." Mary's eyes flashed with determination. "I think you're wrong," she said. "In fact, I know it. There's a music competition happening in the city soon. You should enter." Jack chuckled. "The sound hollow. A competition? Me? I don't even have decent clothes, let alone the confidence to stand on a stage." Mary wasn't deterred. "I have a spare room," she said, her words surprising him. "You can stay with me until the competition. You'll have food, a place to sleep, and time to prepare. I won't take no for an answer." Jack stared at her, stunned by her generosity. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked, his voice wary. Mary's expression softened. "Because I believe in second chances," she said simply. "And because your father believed in you. You may have given up, Jack, but I haven't." Her words struck a chord deep within him, echoing the dreams he had buried long ago. For years, Jack had kept people at arm's length, convinced that no one would truly care about him. But there was something about Mary's sincerity, something in the way she spoke about his father, that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. Jack hesitated, the weight of his pride battling with the pull of this unexpected opportunity. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "All right," he said, "but just until the competition is over." Mary smiled, her warmth radiating through the cold. "That's all I ask." Moving into Mary's modest home was a surreal experience for Jack. The room she offered him was small but comfortable, a bed with a neatly folded quilt, a wooden dresser, and a desk by the window that overlooked the bustling city below. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of stability. It was strange and unfamiliar, and at first, he struggled to adjust. The quiet of the apartment was almost unsettling compared to the chaos of the streets. Doubts crept in during the stillness of the night. Jack would stare at the ceiling, questioning whether he deserved this chance. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man worn down by years of hardship. How could he stand on a stage with polished contestants who had never known his struggles? But each morning, as the sunlight streamed through the window, Mary's unwavering encouragement greeted him. "Your father would be proud," she would say, her voice filled with conviction. "You've got his spirit in you. Jack, don't let it go to waste." Her words became a lifeline, a small beacon of hope that slowly began to take root in his heart. Though he couldn't yet see the path ahead clearly, Jack started to believe just a little that maybe, just maybe, his father's dream wasn't entirely out of reach. Jack Monroe sat by the window of Mary's apartment, his guitar resting on his knee. The familiar weight of it was comforting, a reminder of the one thing that had stayed constant in his life. Outside, the city hummed with activity, but inside the small room, Jack was immersed in his music. He strummed the chords of a song he had written years ago, the melody carrying a bittersweet sense of longing. Each note felt like a piece of his story, fragments of memories and emotions woven together. The door creaked open slightly, breaking Jack's focus. He looked up to see Anna, Mary's daughter, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Anna, a woman in her early 40s, had been distant since Jack had moved in. Their interactions had been polite but brief, as if she were unsure of how to navigate his presence in their home. Today, however, there was a different energy about her. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Anna said softly, stepping into the room. "I heard you playing, and it sounded beautiful." Jack gave a small, uncomfortable smile. Compliments weren't something he was used to receiving. "Thanks," he muttered, unsure what else to say. Anna hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the edge of the bed. Her eyes scanned the guitar in Jack's hands, her expression a mixture of curiosity and sadness. "I used to love music," she said, almost to herself. "My husband played the piano. He'd always play for me after dinner, until the accident." Jack noticed the way her voice caught on the last word. The pain it carried unmistakable. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said sincerely, his voice low. Anna nodded, offering a weak smile. "We all lose people we love eventually, don't we?" she said. "But your music, it feels like you haven't lost everything, like there's still something left for you." Jack looked down at his guitar, her words stirring something deep within him. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I've lost more than I can ever get back. This music, it's all I have left. But even that feels like a distant memory sometimes." Anna studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Maybe that's why it's important," she said. "Because it's still with you. Not many people can say that." Her words lingered in the room long after she left. Jack couldn't help but think about what she had said. Was his music really more than just a survival tool? Could it still be a part of who he was? A link to the boy his father had once believed in so deeply? As the days passed, Jack and Anna's conversations grew longer and more personal. What began as brief exchanges about music turned into late-night talks about life, loss, and the strength it took to keep going. Jack opened up about his father, Michael, and the way he had filled their home with music and hope. He spoke about his mother, Susan, and how her disappearance had left a wound that had never fully healed. "She just left," Jack said one evening, his voice heavy with emotion. "One day she was there, and the next she was gone. No goodbye. No explanation. I searched for her for years, but it was like she vanished into thin air." Anna listened intently, her heart aching for Jack. "You never found out what happened to her?" she asked gently. Jack shook his head. "No. I've told myself she's probably gone by now, one way or another. I try to make peace with it, but it's hard." Anna could see the unresolved pain in his eyes. It was a pain she understood, one that came from unanswered questions and the nagging what-ifs that lingered in the quiet moments. She wanted to help him, to give him some sense of closure. But she also knew Jack wasn't ready to reopen that chapter of his life. Not yet. Unbeknownst to Jack, Anna began to investigate his mother's disappearance. She reached out to old friends of Mary's who might have known Susan, following whatever lead she could find. It was a quiet mission, one she pursued with determination and care, all while continuing to support Jack in his preparation for the competition. Jack, meanwhile, was finding his own rhythm in Mary's home. The more he practiced, the more his confidence grew. Though doubts still crept in, they were countered by the encouragement of both Mary and Anna. Mary would often sit with him during his practice sessions, sharing stories of his father. Michael always had a way of making people feel things with his music, she said one evening, her eyes distant with memory. And you've got that same gift, Jack. You just need to trust it. It wasn't just their encouragement that spurred Jack on. It was the sense of connection he was beginning to feel. Mary's belief in him reminded him of his father's unwavering support, and Anna's quiet strength gave him a newfound sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was carrying his burdens alone. Still, there were moments when the enormity of what lay ahead threatened to overwhelm him. The thought of standing on a stage in front of an audience filled him with a mix of excitement and fear. But when those feelings crept in, Jack turned to his music, letting it ground him. One evening, after a particularly intense practice session, Anna approached him with a tentative smile. "You know," she said, "I think you're going to surprise yourself on that stage." Jack looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll tell you one thing. I wouldn't even be trying if it weren't for you and your mom." Anna's smile widened, her eyes shining. "Well, we believe in you, and I think, deep down, you're starting to believe in yourself too." As Jack settled into bed that night, her words echoed in his mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't just about proving something to others. It was about proving something to himself. And for the first time in years, Jack allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The competition day was fast approaching, and Jack found himself spending hours each day refining his performance. Yet, despite his growing confidence in his music, his thoughts often drifted to the revelations Anna had shared with him. She had been investigating his mother, Susan, following a trail that had seemed cold for years. And now, Anna believed she had found something, a facility in a small town, a place where Susan might still be alive. Jack had initially resisted the idea. The thought of reopening that wound was almost unbearable. For years, he had buried the pain of his mother's disappearance, convincing himself it was better to move on than to hold on to the hope of answers. But Anna's quiet persistence chipped away at his defenses. One evening, as Jack sat with his guitar, Anna joined him in the living room. She carried a folder, its edges worn from handling. "I know you're focusing on the competition," she began carefully, "but I wanted to show you something." Jack glanced at the folder, his expression wary. "Anna, I told you. Just look," she interrupted gently, sliding the folder toward him. "You don't have to decide anything right now, but I think you need to see this." Reluctantly, Jack opened the folder. Inside were records, old photographs, notes from people Anna had contacted, and a report from the facility. One line stood out. Susan Monroe, admitted in 2001 following a mental health crisis. Jack's breath caught. "She's alive," he whispered, his voice trembling. Anna nodded. "I think so. They said she has moments of clarity, but she's been through a lot. I don't know what you'll find." "Jack, but I thought you deserved to know." Jack stared at the papers, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Anger at the years lost, fear of what he might discover, and a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in decades. "I don't know if I can do this," he said finally, his voice breaking. "What if she doesn't even remember me?" Anna placed a hand on his arm, her touch steady and reassuring. "If she doesn't, then we'll face that together. But if she does, wouldn't you want to know?" For a long moment, Jack said nothing. Then he nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's go." The drive to the facility the next morning was quiet. Mary had insisted on staying behind, giving Jack and Anna the space to face this moment together. Jack gripped the armrest tightly as the miles ticked by, his mind racing with questions. What would she look like? Would she recognize him? And if she didn't, could he handle it? When they arrived, a nurse greeted them with a kind smile. Susan Monroe is in the common room, she said. She spends most of her time there, by the window. Jack's legs felt heavy as he followed the nurse down the quiet corridor. His heart pounded in his chest, each step bringing him closer to an answer he wasn't sure he was ready for. When they entered the room, Jack's eyes immediately found her. Susan sat by the window, her gray hair neatly brushed, her hands folded in her lap. She stared out at the garden beyond the glass, her expression serene but distant. She looked older than Jack had imagined, the lines on her face telling the story of years gone by. And yet, there was something unmistakably familiar about her. The tilt of her head, the way her fingers tapped gently against her knee, as if to a rhythm only she could hear. Jack froze in the doorway, his breath catching. "Mom," he said softly. Susan turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, there was nothing, just a blank stare, as if she were looking through him. Jack's heart sank, but then her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition sparking to life. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack felt his knees give way as he dropped in front of her, tears streaming down his face. "It's me, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "It's Jack." Susan reached out a shaky hand, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought you were gone." Jack clung to her hands, his own shaking. "I thought you left me," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "All these years, I thought you were gone, that you didn't want me." Susan's face crumpled, her tears flowing freely. "I never wanted to leave you," she whispered. "I was so lost after your father died. I didn't know how to cope. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. But I see now. I hurt you." They stayed like that for what felt like hours, holding each other and crying for the years they had lost. The pain of the past was still there, but in that moment, it was tempered by the relief of reunion. Susan might not be the same woman Jack remembered, but she was his mother, and she was alive. Later, as they drove back to the city, Jack was quiet, still processing the emotional whirlwind of the day. Anna glanced at him, her concern evident. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Jack sighed, his hands gripping the wheel. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's a lot to take in, but I'm glad I went. I needed to see her." Anna smiled gently. "I'm glad too. I think it's the beginning of something for both of you." Jack nodded, the weight in his chest feeling just a little lighter. For the first time in years, the unanswered questions about his past had started to find resolution. And though the journey wasn't over, he felt a spark of hope that it might lead him somewhere he could finally find peace. The final round of the competition was just days away, but Jack's mind was still lingering on the encounter with his mother. Seeing Susan again had stirred something deep within him, a mix of closure, relief, and a rekindling of the belief that healing was possible. It had been years since he had felt connected to his past, but now, for the first time, he could see the threads of his life weaving together. His father's dreams, his mother's pain, and his own struggles. They weren't disconnected fragments anymore. They were part of a larger story, one he was finally beginning to understand. Back at Mary's apartment, Jack threw himself into his music with a renewed sense of purpose. His rehearsals became more intense, each note carrying the weight of his journey. Mary would often sit in the living room, listening with a proud smile as Jack practiced the song he had written for the competition's final round. "You've come so far, Jack," she said one evening, her voice filled with emotion. "Your father would be over the moon to see you now." Jack smiled at her, the warmth in her words giving him the strength to keep going. "I just hope I can do him justice," he said softly. "You already have," Mary replied. "The moment you decided to fight for this, you honored him." Anna was also a constant presence, offering quiet support and encouragement. Their connection had deepened over the past weeks, and Jack found himself looking to her not just as a friend, but as someone who understood him in ways no one else could. She had become his anchor, reminding him of the importance of facing the future with courage. As the day of the final competition arrived, Jack felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. The auditorium buzzed with energy as contestants prepared backstage, their voices filling the air with snippets of melodies and harmonies. Jack stood apart, his guitar slung over his shoulder, taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart. He didn't wear flashy clothes or carry the polished demeanor of the other contestants, but he carried something they didn't, an authenticity forged by years of struggle and resilience. When his name was called, Jack stepped onto the stage, the spotlight blinding him for a moment. The audience was a sea of faces, their eyes fixed on him as he adjusted the strap of his guitar. For a brief second, doubt crept in. Could he do this? Could he stand before these people and pour out his soul? Then he remembered his father's words. The world needs to hear your voice. Jack, don't let it go to waste. Jack began to play. The first chords were soft and hesitant, but as the melody unfolded, his fingers found their rhythm. His voice, rough but deeply emotive, filled the auditorium. The song was a reflection of his journey, a ballad about loss, redemption, and finding hope in the unlikeliest places. Every lyric carried the weight of his story, and as he sang, he felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. The audience was captivated. There was a vulnerability in Jack's performance that set him apart from the other contestants. This wasn't just a song, it was a confession, a plea, and a promise all rolled into one. As the final notes faded, the room fell silent. For a moment, Jack feared he had failed. But then, the applause began. It started as a ripple and grew into a thunderous roar, the audience rising to their feet in unison. Backstage, Mary and Anna were waiting for him, their faces lit with pride. Mary pulled him into a tight hug, her eyes brimming with tears. You were incredible, Jack, she said. Your father would be so proud. Anna stood a step behind, her smile soft but radiant. You did it, she said, her voice steady. You really did it. Jack felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the applause or the recognition. It was the knowledge that he had found his voice again, that he had honored his father and reconnected with the part of himself he thought he had lost. As the competition ended and the audience dispersed, Jack stood outside the auditorium with Mary and Anna, the cold night air biting at his skin. He looked up at the stars, a sense of peace settling over him. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Jack's life began to change. The competition opened doors he had never imagined, and he started to receive invitations to perform at local venues. But more than that, Jack found a deeper calling. Inspired by his journey and the people who had supported him, he began working with Mary and Anna to create something meaningful, a community center for those who had experienced hardship, a place where they could find their voices and rebuild their lives. They called it the Second Song, a name that symbolized second chances and the belief that everyone had a melody worth sharing. The center quickly became a haven for people from all walks of life, musicians, artists, and those simply seeking a place to belong. Jack used his own story as a beacon, showing others that no matter how lost they felt, there was always a way forward. Susan, Jack's mother, became a quiet presence in his life. Though her memory wasn't always clear, there were moments of connection that made all the difference. Jack would visit her regularly, bringing his guitar and playing the songs his father used to sing. In those moments, he saw glimpses of the woman she had been, and it gave him hope that their relationship could continue to heal. Jack and Anna's bond also deepened, their shared journey bringing them closer together. What began as friendship grew into something more. And in Anna, Jack found a partner who understood his heart and shared his dreams. Together, they worked to build a future filled with music, love, and purpose. One evening, as Jack stood on the stage at the Second Song, his guitar in hand, he looked out at the crowd. It was a mix of faces, some familiar, others new, but all of them were united by the music. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of belonging he had searched for his entire life. This song, he said, his voice steady, is for anyone who's ever felt lost. It's for everyone who's ever needed a second chance. You're not alone, and you never have to be. As the first chords filled the room, Jack's voice soared, carrying the promise of hope and redemption. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had become his family, Jack knew he had finally found his place in the world. Thank you for joining us on this inspiring journey through Jack's story, a tale of redemption, second chances, and the power of connection. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe to Empathy Stories for more uplifting narratives that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Don't forget to share this video with someone who could use a little hope today. See you next time.